During a family dinner, I accidentally bumped into my stepmother. She slapped me hard in front of my dad and hissed, "You're just like your mother." My dad stayed silent as everyone watched. I left the dinner, but when they got back home, a shocking surprise awaited them. I'm Nora, 34 now, but I was 29 when this all went down. I live in Seattle, work in publishing, and try to stay out of my family's orbit as much as I can. Until that night, I hadn't been home in over a year. My relationship with my father, Leon, was always polite on the surface and awkward underneath. We talked on holidays, maybe a birthday text here and there. The truth is, I never really forgave him for what happened after my mom died. She passed when I was 16. Ovarian cancer, long, slow, cruel. My dad was lost after that. I get it now, more than I did back then. But what I couldn't understand, and still can't fully, is how he moved Cambria into our house within the same year. Cambria was his old coworker, a financial consultant. Smooth, calculated, always perfectly dressed. She took over the house, like she'd been planning it all along. Started small, organizing the kitchen, repainting walls, rearranging furniture, then bigger, deciding where I should go to college, what I should major in, how I should present myself as a young woman. At first, I tried to get along with her, but she made it clear I wasn't part of her plan. She called me difficult, moody, disrespectful. She said my mother had spoiled me when I fought back. She told my dad I needed therapy, that I was grieving wrong. He never defended me, so I left. I got into a state university with a good scholarship and moved into a dorm, 6 hours away. I kept busy. I built a life, and I tried not to look back too often. But this dinner, it was supposed to be a birthday celebration for my dad. His big 60, a milestone. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could play happy family for one night. The restaurant was one of those trendy places, downtown somewhere on Burnside. They served artisanal cocktails and had decorative moss on the walls. Our party took up most of the private dining room. The air was thick with awkward politeness. I sat near the end of the table next to Marn. Marn is Cambria's daughter, from a previous marriage. She's about 5 years younger than me, and for most of our lives we barely tolerated each other. We were pitted against one another, growing up intentionally or not. Marn was the golden child, the one who called Cambria mom and got extra dessert. I was the rebellious stepdaughter who refused to fall in line. But that night Marn looked different, tired, maybe nervous. She smiled at me with something that resembled empathy. We were halfway through dinner when it happened. I got up to use the restroom on the way back. I swerved slightly to avoid a waiter carrying a heavy tray. In doing so, I accidentally brushed into Cambria's chair. Not hard. Not even enough to make her spill her wine, just enough for her to feel it. She turned slowly, looked me in the eye, and slapped me. It was fast and loud, and the shock of it froze me in place. Everyone at the table turned. The restaurant, which was already on the quieter side, dropped into total silence. Then she leaned in low enough that only a few nearby could hear, and hissed, "You're just like your mother." I didn't say anything. I just looked at my dad. He was staring into his mashed potatoes, like they held the secrets of the universe. I waited. Nothing. Not a word. Not a flicker of recognition that something monumental had just happened in front of him, his entire family, and half of Portland. So I left. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I didn't even call anyone. I just drove back to the Airbnb I'd rented and sat on the bed in my coat. The city buzzed outside, and I sat perfectly still, staring at the floor. Something inside me snapped, violently, quietly, like the last thread in an old sweater. Finally giving out, I pulled out my laptop and started writing. At first, I wrote to vent, just a journal entry, but the more I typed, the more I realized how long I'd been swallowing things. Not just the slap, but the years of silence. Way my dad let Cambria rewrite our family's history. The way I'd been gaslit into believing I was the problem. So I posted it, not under my name, of course. I posted it to a subreddit I'd followed for years, raised by narcissists. I used fake names, described everything. The slap, the dinner, years before it. I thought maybe a few people would read it. Maybe someone would comment, "You're not crazy." Instead, it exploded thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments, people sharing their own stories, telling me they believed me, that I wasn't overreacting, that my silence all those years was survival. And then Marn messaged me. It was brief. "Nora, I read your post. I know it's you and I believe everything. Can we talk?" We met the next morning at a small cafe near Powell's Books. I'd been dreading it, but she showed up wearing no makeup, a hoodie and no Cambria polish. She looked like she hadn't slept, and she talked. What she said surprised me. She told me she'd always suspected something wasn't right, that Cambria was different, with her than with others, that she'd overheard conversations, that she felt isolated, controlled, that the slap had been the last straw for her too. "Didn't know what she was doing to you," she said. "Not really. But that night she showed everyone who she really is. We hatched a plan. It wasn't revenge. It was truth." When they got back home from the dinner, full tipsy, expecting the house to be quiet, I was already there. So was Marn, and so was a file folder inside it. Everything printed, screenshots of Cambria's texts, photos from years ago, things I'd taken and kept in an old Dropbox folder of Cambria cornering me in our kitchen, her finger in my face, old letters from my mom, her final thoughts about Cambria hidden in a jewelry box, found after the funeral, records showing how she began seeing my dad before my mom had passed. It was all there. The air in the living room that night felt like static. "I'll pause here for now." My dad stood at the doorway, key still in his hand, as he looked at me sitting calmly on the couch. Folder of evidence opened across the coffee table. Cambria came in right behind him mid-sentence, still caught in whatever fake recounting of the dinner she'd been giving him in the car. When she saw me and Marn standing just to my right, she stopped cold. The silence that filled the room wasn't like the one at the restaurant. This one was heavy, suffocating, the kind that presses against your skin and makes your thoughts feel louder than any noise could. "What is?" my dad asked, slowly setting his keys down. Cambria's expression hardened before he even reached the coffee table. She already knew. She always knew. That was the thing about Cambria. She was never caught off guard. But for the first time I saw something flicker behind her composure. Not panic, not regret, but calculation. She was already planning her version of the story. Marn was the first to speak. Her voice didn't shake, but it wasn't steady either. "You need to see what's in that folder, Dad." He looked between us both, then down at the papers. Slowly he sat on the couch and picked up first page. It was a printout of the Reddit post. I had removed the usernames and anonymized the details, but it was all there. Every line, every quote, everything that had happened that night at dinner, and all the years leading up to it, laid out plainly, without drama, without embellishment, just the truth. As he read, the color in his face changed from pink to pale to something like gray. I watched his hands tighten slightly at the edges of the pages. Cambria stood there, her arms crossed, her head tilted, like she was waiting for the punchline of a bad joke. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp. "You're both being ridiculous. She's always been like this, dramatic, vindictive, obsessed with dragging me through the mud." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Marn reached forward and turned the page for him. The next was a screenshot of a text Cambria had sent Marn 2 years ago, one that said, "Your sister will always be a problem until your father finally sees her for what she is, an ungrateful version of her dying mother." He read it, and read it again. Cambria flinched just slightly when she realized which text it was that was taken out of context. She snapped. "It was a joke. A bad one." "Do I look like I'm laughing?" Marn said. Her voice didn't rise, but it hit harder than anything else in the room. He kept flipping through the pages. Letters my mom had written before she died. Ones I'd found tucked away years ago, but never shown him. In one she expressed concern about his friendship with Cambria, and how quickly it had grown too personal. She said she knew he'd never admit it to himself while she was alive, but that she could feel something changing, that she was afraid for me. And there it was, her handwriting, her words, her warning. My father closed the folder for a long time. He didn't say anything. Cambria, sensing his silence as opportunity, tried again. "She's poisoning you, Leon. she said, gesturing to me. She's been holding on to these twisted versions of the past for years. You think it's coincidence? She came back now all times for your birthday and suddenly she has a folder full of lies. She's manipulating you. She didn't slap herself, Cambria, Marn said flatly. Cambria's eyes narrowed at her. You're just siding with her because you've always been jealous. You think I didn't notice how cold you've been lately. The shift was sudden. I'd seen it before, the pivot from defensive to offensive. She was trying to make Marn doubt herself, pull her back into the fold. It had worked for years. I watched Marn's jaw tighten that night. Marn said was the first time I saw who you really are. The way you looked at her, the things you said, you slapped her in public, and then acted like she deserved it. And she turned to Dad. You just sat there like it was normal. My father still hadn't spoken. He was staring into space, jaw clenched, breathing slow. Finally he stood up. He didn't look at either us. He looked at Cambria. His voice, when it came, was soft, but deadly calm. You told me Nora was exaggerating, that she was difficult, that she was trying to punish me for moving on. Cambria said, nothing. She left because of you. He said. That's when she snapped. No, she hissed. She left because she couldn't stand not being the center of your world anymore. She always hated me from day one. You think I didn't feel it? She was 16. Cambria's mouth twisted. She looked at him like he was the one who'd betrayed her. I gave everything to this family, she said. You think I put up with your daughter's attitude, your spineless silences, and your depressive sulking for fun? I carried this house while you buried yourself in guilt for years, and now you're going to believe him over. He didn't answer. She waited. Still nothing. Then she picked up her purse. This is pathetic, she said. I'm done here. She walked out the front door, slamming it behind her. The echo vibrated through the walls. The silence she left behind was different, hollow. My dad sat back down. Marn stayed still for the first time in years. I didn't feel tense in that house. I didn't feel like I needed to defend my version of things. Everything had been said, everything that mattered, but the truth was the hardest part hadn't even begun, and I wasn't sure we were ready for it. After the front door slammed, the silence that followed wasn't comforting or peaceful. It was the kind that buzzed in your ears. You could hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen, the gentle tick of the old wall clock above the entryway, and the distant rush of cars from outside and underneath. All that could feel my heart pounding, not out of fear, but something more like exhaustion, the emotional kind. My dad sat on the edge of the couch, with his hands folded between his knees. He looked smaller than usual, older, like the years had suddenly caught up to him in the span of 10 minutes. I didn't know she texted that to you, he said to Marn. His voice was quiet. Rot, she said. Worse, Marn replied. I didn't keep all of it. I didn't say anything I didn't trust myself to. He turned to me then. His eyes were red, but there weren't any tears, just weariness, the kind people carry when they ignored something for far too long. You kept this all to yourself. For how long? I shrugged. I stopped counting. He exhaled like someone who just realized the thing they'd built their life around had been a lie. They willingly swallowed it. Would have been easy to jump in and say, I told you so, to push, to unload. But I didn't, not because I didn't feel it, but because I could see that he was finally beginning to see it all. Himself. The silence was never just about ignoring, it was complicity. And he knew it. What surprised me most was Marn staying. She didn't have to. This wasn't really her fight. She could have left, right after Cambria did, and gone back to the carefully curated world she'd spent years building under Cambria's shadow. But she sat down on the other armchair across from Dad, curling her legs up underneath her like it was something she used to do there. As a kid, I sat across from them and just watched for a moment. Three people who, for most of their lives, pretended to be family because that's what was expected. Finally, sitting in a room, without pretending. I don't know how to undo any of this, he said after a while, looking at his hands. You don't, said. That's not really how it works. He nodded slowly, but didn't look up. We didn't talk much more that night. Marn and I left together, and Dad didn't ask us to stay. I think he needed that time alone. The house felt heavy with years of avoidance. Letting us go that night might have been the first choice he'd made, without Cambria's influence in a long time. Marn and I walked back to her car in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. "I always thought you were the strong one," she said as she unlocked her door. I blinked. "What you left, you got out. I thought you were angry and selfish. But you were just saving yourself." I didn't know what to say to that. I'd carried the label of the difficult one for so long. I didn't know what to do with someone calling me strong, especially her that night. I stayed in a guest room at Marn's apartment. She lived in a modest place in the Buckman neighborhood. Nothing fancy but cozy, and more personal than I'd expected. Her walls were covered with little framed quotes and old postcards. Her couch had a knit blanket that reminded me of the ones Mom used to crochet. We stayed up talking until 2 about how different it had been for both of us, even under the same roof. About how Cambria had played us against each other without either of us seeing it clearly. She always made me feel like I was the reason things weren't working. Marn confessed, lying on her side staring at the ceiling. "Even when I was just a kid." I nodded. "She did that to all of us. Especially Dad. Do you think he really didn't see it?" I thought about that. I think he chose not to, because seeing it meant admitting what he'd done to you, to me, to Mom. Marn didn't respond, but her hand drifted toward mine on the couch, and she gave it a gentle squeeze. For the first time in our lives, we weren't rivals. We were survivors of the same war. The days that followed were quieter, but messier. I didn't go back to Seattle right away. I stayed in Portland for a while, working remotely from Marn's place, and checking on Dad every couple of days. He was always alone. Now Cambria had moved in with a friend in Lake Oigo, temporarily, or so we heard. He never said much when I visited, but he was always cleaning something, rearranging bookshelves, scrubbing counters that didn't need scrubbing, going through old boxes in the garage. I think he was trying to figure out what in that house was actually his, and what had been hers all along. Marn visited too, sometimes together, sometimes alone. The three of us never talked about what happened at the restaurant again. It was as if revisiting it would break whatever fragile truce we were living in now. One afternoon, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, a photo album in front of him. One of the old ones back when photos were printed and slipped behind plastic sheets, instead of living in phones. He was flipping through them slowly, like photo needed its own moment. "This was your mom's," he said without looking up. "She made this album the summer we took you to Cannon Beach." I remembered that trip. I was maybe 9. I'd spent the whole week collecting broken seashells and building lopsided castles. Mom had worn that ugly straw hat she loved, and Dad had actually smiled. I remembered that because it was rare. "She wrote little notes under some of these," he said, flipping to another page, "and she had neat little cursive letters under each photo. Nora's first tide pool, best grilled cheese in Oregon. Leon's terrible sunburn." Paused at one note that just read, "So much laughter today. I hope it sticks." Neither of us said anything, but I knew what he was thinking. The laughter hadn't stuck. It had evaporated quietly, lost in all the silence that followed. "I think I forgot who I was after she died," he said. "I was scared, lonely, and Cambria, she filled the space so fast." I didn't question it. "I know," I said, "but that's not an excuse." "No, it's not," he nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." And while the words didn't fix everything, they were a start. We still hadn't heard from Cambria directly. She hadn't called, emailed, or shown up. Didn't expect her to. She wasn't the type to come back unless she had a plan. And part of me worried she was out there, crafting her version of the story for someone else to hear. But something told me we hadn't heard the last of her. Not yet. A week after the confrontation, things began to settle. It was like the dust had started to clear, but instead of revealing ruins, it showed the twisted structure we'd all been living in for years. My dad kept sorting through papers. Marn went back to work though, but we stayed in touch daily. I moved my flight a couple of times,
sensing something wasn't quite finished. And then came the lawyer's letter. Cambria wasn't done after all. She'd filed for legal separation, and in the same breath, demanded spousal support and full ownership of the house. The same house. My mother had once picked out the same one. My mom had paid most of the down payment on, with an inheritance from her father. Apparently, Cambria believed her 15 years of emotional labor entitled her to everything. She also requested a few items from the house that she claimed were hers, including bizarrely a collection of antique teacups that had belonged to my mother's grandmother. She said my mother had given them to her before she died, which was a lie. So absurd. I laughed when I read it. She's trying to gaslight you through legal paperwork, I said when my dad called me. He didn't laugh. He looked like a man coming out of anesthesia, painfully aware now, unsure how long he'd been unconscious. We met with an attorney. One of Marn's friends had recommended her a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Samira, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. The moment we laid out everything, texts, photos, even the letter from my mom, Samira raised an eyebrow, said, "This isn't going to go the way she thinks." And it didn't. Turns out Cambria had never legally been added to the deed on the house. She'd assumed she was entitled to half because of their long marriage, but the house had been purchased before they married, and my dad had never taken steps to legally transfer any portion of it to her. It was 100% his, and by extension potentially part of my mother's estate. And remember those teacups? Yeah, my mom had itemized a lot of her valuables before she passed. I'd found the document while helping my dad clean out the basement. Teacups were explicitly listed as to be passed to Nora. When she turns 30, I was 34. We didn't tell Cambria immediately. We waited until the day of mediation, when she showed up in a stiff beige suit, all faux dignity and smugness. Her lawyer, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shuffled through his notes as Samira dropped one bomb after another: property ownership, estate documents, text messages, the full Reddit post, attached with a note from the family therapist we'd consulted stating that the incident had caused significant emotional distress for me and unresolved trauma tied to my mother's death. I watched Cambria's face fall in slow motion. She blinked a few times, tried to speak. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, and then Samira smiled. "We're willing to walk away quietly," she said. "No public fuss, but we wanted on record that she gets nothing from the house, none of the items listed in the will, and no spousal support. If she declines, we're prepared to file a counterclaim for emotional wrongful interference with estate assets, and intentional infliction of distress. And of course we'll be sharing those texts with family and mutual acquaintances. Your call." Cambria sat in silence for a moment, her hands clenched into fists. In her lap, she looked at my dad, who wouldn't even meet her gaze. Then she nodded, eyes burning. It was done. The following months were in their own strange way healing. My dad started going to therapy voluntarily. He called me once a week, just to talk. Sometimes he'd share a memory of Mom, something he hadn't dared to say in years. Marn and I became close in ways we never had as kids. We visited the coast together, went through old photo boxes, and laughed at the weird things parents used to do. We took the teacups out of storage and used them, once delicate porcelain, fragile and beautiful. My mother's initials were etched on the bottom of each one. Cambria. She faded out. We heard she moved to a small condo and tigered. She tried reaching out to some family members to explain her side, but too many people had seen the truth. By then, the silence that followed her wasn't protective anymore. It was isolation. And the house. My dad made one final decision. He signed over 50% of it to me. "It's what your mother would have wanted," he said. "It's what I should have done years ago. We didn't throw a party, we didn't light anything on fire. We didn't scream or cry or post her name online. We just quietly dismantled the false narrative she'd spent years building, and it was enough. Sometimes revenge doesn't need to be dramatic or cruel. Sometimes it's as simple as telling the truth and watching it hold up under the weight of lies. Sometimes the best revenge is living in the house she tried to steal, with your name on the deed, your sister in the guest room, and your mother's teacups in your hands, knowing that she can never take any of it away again.